The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over a restless sea. The grey waters of the English Channel churned with the movement of one of the largest armadas in human history. Thousands of ships, from towering warships to tiny landing craft, advanced toward the beaches of Normandy. Among them, the men of the British Second Army readied themselves for the longest day of their lives. Their objective was not merely to land, it was to break through, drive inland, and capture the city of Caen. Caen was no ordinary prize. It was a crossroads city, a vital junction of roads and railways that led to every corner of northern France. Whoever held Caen controlled access to the plains beyond, the open ground essential for tanks and the expansion of the Allied invasion. For Field Marshal Montgomery, commander of the Allied ground forces, Caen was key to anchoring the eastern flank of the invasion. Its capture would secure the beaches from German counterattack and open the way for a breakout into the heart of occupied France. But as the first landing craft approached the coast, no one aboard knew just how fiercely the Germans intended to hold it. The British landings were assigned to 3 beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each stretching along the Norman shoreline east of the Americans at Omaha. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. Battleships like HMS Warspite and HMS Ramillies opened fire, their shells screaming overhead and pounding German defenses along the bluffs. The sea roared back with explosions and smoke. Then came the moment of truth. Landing craft dropped their ramps, and British and Canadian troops surged into the surf, bullets snapping around them. On Sword Beach, the men of the 3rd British Division waded ashore under relentless machine gun fire. The sand was littered with obstacles, mines, metal stakes, and hedgehogs meant to tear through landing craft. Engineers worked furiously to clear paths while infantry pressed inland, house to house through seaside villages like Lyons-sur-Mer. Supporting them were the Churchill tanks of the 13th 18th Hussars, their treads grinding through the shallows and dragging themselves onto the beach to blast apart German pillboxes. By mid-morning, the British had carved out a fragile foothold. But beyond the dunes lay open fields, perfect killing ground for German armour. Montgomery's plan was ambitious. Within hours of landing, British forces were to push inland, capture Caen, and establish a firm defensive line along the Orne River. From there, they could repel German counterattacks and prepare for the drive toward Paris. Yet within those same hours, German commanders were already reacting. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near the city, received orders to move. Columns of armoured vehicles rolled toward the front, the first major German counterattack of D-Day already forming before the Allies could consolidate their gains. By afternoon, British troops of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry advanced along the Caen Road. Ahead, black smoke rose from burning villages. German tanks appeared from behind hedgerows and orchards, firing point blank. The panzers tore into the British spearhead, scattering infantry and knocking out several Shermans. For hours, the battlefield was chaos. Close-range duels between tanks, gunfire echoing off stone walls, and the scream of incoming shells. Only when reinforcements from the 27th Armoured Brigade arrived did the British manage to halt the counterattack. By evening, they had dug in roughly 3 miles short of their objective. The Canadians on Juno Beach fared little better. They had fought their way 7 miles inland, capturing Bernières and Benny-sur-Mer, but every advance came at terrible cost. German resistance stiffened as they neared Caen's outskirts. The 12th SS Panzer Division, made up largely of fanatical Hitler youth, was now moving into position to block any further progress. The Canadians found themselves in bitter fights around every hedgerow, facing young but zealous defenders who refused to retreat. By nightfall on D-Day, the British and Canadians held their beachheads but had failed to take Caen. The city's church spires, visible on the horizon that morning, now lay beyond a wall of enemy fire. It was a setback Montgomery had not anticipated. Still, the landings had succeeded in establishing a firm foothold along the coast. The British Second Army had come ashore in strength, but Caen, the cornerstone of their strategy, remained out of reach. In the hours after sunset, Montgomery convened his commanders in a makeshift field tent near the beachhead. Reports poured in, progress in some sectors, heavy losses in others. The men were exhausted, many hadn't slept for 2 days, and yet the urgency was clear. The Germans would counterattack at dawn. Intelligence confirmed that multiple panzer divisions were already on the move. Montgomery, calm and deliberate, decided that Caen would be taken not by reckless rush, but by steady pressure. "We shall hold what we have gained," he said, "and draw the enemy into battle." On the German side, chaos mixed with determination. Field Marshal Rommel, responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall, was away in Germany when the invasion began. His subordinates scrambled to respond. Hitler, convinced the landings at Normandy were a diversion, initially refused to release armoured reserves. When permission finally came, the delays were fatal. By the time Rommel returned to France, Allied forces had already dug in. Still, German commanders understood the importance of Caen. Holding the city meant containing the Allies on the beaches. Losing it could unravel the entire western defence. Through the following night, German reinforcements poured toward the city, convoys of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks snaking through the countryside. Pilots of the Royal Air Force spotted them and called in strikes, but the darkness shielded much of the movement. By dawn on June 7th, the Germans had formed a defensive ring around Caen, transforming the surrounding villages into fortress positions. Every farmhouse was a bunker, every hedgerow a trap. As the second day of the invasion began, the British were confronted with the grim reality of what lay ahead. The open advance Montgomery had envisioned turned into a grinding close-quarter struggle for every field, every hedge, and every ridge. The battle for Caen would not be won in hours or even days. It would become a relentless campaign of attrition, fought across shattered countryside and through the streets of a doomed city. For the soldiers on the ground, there was little sense of grand strategy, only exhaustion and the ever-present thunder of artillery. Infantrymen dug foxholes into the French earth, their faces black with soot, their ears ringing from bombardment. Tank crews worked tirelessly to repair damaged tracks and replace burned-out engines. Medics moved through the lines, tending to the wounded in makeshift aid stations behind the beaches. Above them, Allied aircraft crisscrossed the sky, their contrails streaking the horizon like chalk lines over a dark canvas. By June's first evening, one truth had become clear. Caen would define the British campaign in Normandy. It was the hinge of the entire front, the prize that both sides were willing to bleed for. The Allies had landed and survived. The Germans had held their ground, and between them a city stood waiting, its ancient walls soon to be caught in the storm. The morning after D-Day dawned with low clouds and drifting smoke over the beaches. The sea behind the British and Canadian armies was a grey, restless expanse filled with ships and wreckage. Men who had survived the first day of the invasion were already digging in, fortifying what they had taken. Montgomery's headquarters buzzed with tension. Caen still loomed ahead, close enough to see its church spires, yet as distant as ever. German reinforcements were moving swiftly. Overnight, the 21st Panzer Division had regrouped south of Caen, while the 12th SS Panzer, made up largely of Hitler Youth, began to arrive from the east. Veterans of the Afrika Korps joined fresh-faced fanatics who had never before faced battle. Their commanders ordered them forward with a single purpose: to throw the British and Canadians back into the sea. For the men on the ground, there was little rest. British infantry pushed beyond the beachhead into terrain unlike anything they had faced before. The bocage, the patchwork of small fields divided by sunken lanes and ancient hedgerows, turned every advance into a deadly maze. The fields were green and quiet from above, but within them lurked machine guns, mines, and snipers. Tanks struggled to move without exposing their flanks, and infantry had to fight through thick walls of roots and earth, one hedgerow at a time. Every field captured meant another to cross under fire. By June 8th, the front line had begun to take shape. To the east, the British 6th Airborne Division held their ground across the Orne River. These men had landed by glider and parachute in the early hours of D-Day, capturing the vital bridges at Pegasus and Ranville. Now they faced counterattacks from Panzer grenadiers determined to crush the bridgehead. Artillery from the beaches rumbled in support, as British paratroopers, running low on ammunition, used captured German weapons to hold their positions. They had no illusions. If those bridges fell, the entire right flank of the invasion could unravel. West of the Orne, the Canadians of the 3rd Division advanced through the villages north of Caen. Every farmstead became a fortress. At the village of Authie, the Canadians met the 12th SS head-on. The fight was savage and close. Young German soldiers, many barely 18, fought with fanatic resolve. When the Canadians finally took the village, the ground was littered with burned-out half-tracks and the bodies of boys in black SS uniforms. Prisoners taken from the Hitler Youth Division revealed the depth of their indoctrination. Some refused food, others spat at their captors. The war in Normandy was already becoming a brutal, personal struggle. Meanwhile, Montgomery's broader strategy was taking shape. His goal was to draw the bulk of German armour toward Caen. If he could pin down the panzer divisions, the Americans on the western flank could break through the countryside toward Cherbourg and beyond. It was a plan of pressure and patience, methodical rather than spectacular. Yet for the soldiers of the British Second Army, it meant days of unrelenting combat without visible progress. On June the 10th, German command launched its first major counterstroke. Armoured columns surged toward the Orne bridgehead, led by veteran officers who had fought from Africa to the Eastern Front. The attack slammed into the lines held by the 6th Airborne and the British 3rd Division. The air shook with the roar of engines and the crack of anti-tank fire. For hours, the two sides fought among the orchards and hamlets east of Caen until British artillery finally blunted the assault. When the smoke cleared, dozens of German tanks lay smouldering in the fields, their blackened hulks surrounded by silent crews. The line had held, but the cost was heavy. Montgomery now saw his opportunity. He ordered a renewed advance toward Caen, a slow tightening of the noose. The British War Corps moved along the eastern bank of the Orne, while X Corps pressed from the west. The intention was to envelop the city from both sides, choking off its defences before the final assault. But the Germans were far from beaten. From the south, the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most elite units in Hitler's army, arrived to reinforce Caen's defenders. Their tanks and self-propelled guns dug in behind every ridge and farmhouse, perfectly concealed in the bocage. Each attempt to move forward met a storm of fire. By mid-June, the battle around Caen had become a war of attrition. Villages changed hands multiple times. At Rots and Le Mesnil-Patry, British and Canadian units found themselves ambushed by hidden panzers waiting behind stone walls. A single Tiger tank could dominate a field for hours until Allied artillery or air power silenced it. The countryside, once lush with wheat and hedges, was now scarred by shell fire. Dead livestock lay where they had fallen. Burned-out tanks stood like monuments to futility. For the German soldiers defending Caen, the battle had turned into a desperate struggle for time. Hitler's orders were absolute: hold the city at all costs. reinforcements were scarce and Allied aircraft ruled the skies. Every daylight movement risked destruction from above. Convoys travelled only at night, headlights blacked out, drivers following the glow of cigarettes in the darkness. Yet even under constant bombardment, the German line refused to break. The Wehrmacht's defensive tactics, using the terrain, creating interlocking fields of fire, and counter-attacking in small, disciplined groups, turned every mile into a death trap. At Montgomery's headquarters, frustration simmered. Reports from the front painted a picture of stubborn progress, measured in yards, not miles. The general himself remained calm. He understood the pressure he was applying was working. German intelligence noted that by June 12th, the majority of their armoured strength in Normandy was concentrated opposite the British and Canadians around Caen. The Americans on the western flank faced lighter opposition as a result. Montgomery's gamble to turn Caen into the magnet that drew the German army was paying off, even if the men on the ground could not yet see it. Among the soldiers, weariness was becoming its own enemy. The weather turned foul, with drenching rain that turned the fields to mud. Supply trucks bogged down, and food arrived late or spoiled. The smell of decay hung over the lines. Letters from home were read and reread in muddy trenches. The men learned to sleep under artillery fire, waking only when the guns fell silent. Some began to measure time by the rhythm of bombardments, each one a heartbeat in the long, grinding effort toward Caen. Through it all, the Allied command prepared for the next great push. Reinforcements and equipment poured into Normandy. Airfields were built behind the lines and bridges thrown across the Orne to support future offensives. Tanks were repaired, infantry regrouped, and plans were drawn for an operation that Montgomery hoped would finally break the deadlock. The men called it Epsom. As June 15th arrived, the front had stabilized into a shape that historians would later describe as a cauldron, a boiling enclosed battlefield where both armies fed in men and machines, only to see them consumed by the fight. The Allies held the initiative, but progress came only through grinding sacrifice. The Germans clung to every inch, aware that each day they delayed the British bought time for reinforcements to arrive from the east. For the civilians trapped inside Caen, the nightmare was already beyond endurance. Bombs and shells fell day and night. Entire neighbourhoods were destroyed. Those who could fled into cellars, living by candlelight, and scavenging what food remained. The city that had once been a medieval jewel of Normandy was fast becoming a battlefield. Its fate would soon be sealed by the inferno still to come. In these days after D-Day, the Allied foothold was secure, but the war for Caen had only just begun. The soldiers who looked across the smoking fields knew the worst was ahead. The campaign was shifting from the thunder of invasion to the slow, relentless grind of siege warfare. The next chapter of the battle, the British offensive across the Odon River and the fight for Hill 112, would decide whether Caen could finally be taken or whether it would remain the heart of German resistance in Normandy. By the third week of June 1944, Normandy had settled into a war of exhaustion. The storm that had begun with the thunder of invasion was now a steady grinding pressure along every hedgerow and ridge. Around Caen, the British Second Army had been locked in place for nearly 2 weeks. The city stood only a few miles away, its church towers still visible through the haze, but between the Allies and their prize lay a belt of villages, rivers and high ground defended by some of the most experienced German soldiers still left in France. Montgomery's attention turned to a new operation, one that would try to break the stalemate and finally turn the siege of Caen into a breakthrough. It was called Operation Epsom, and it would be the first major British offensive since D-Day. The plan was simple in theory, yet perilous in execution. 8th Corps, composed of 3 fresh divisions supported by hundreds of tanks, would strike west of Caen, cross the Odon and Orne rivers, and seize the high ground beyond. Once established on the southern slopes, British artillery could dominate the approaches to Caen, and the German defenders would be forced to withdraw. To Montgomery, it was a carefully calculated blow, using power and precision rather than speed. The weather in the days before the assault was miserable. Rain swept across the Normandy fields, turning the earth into slick mud that clung to boots and treads. Supply lines became quagmires, but the preparations continued. Columns of tanks rolled forward under the cover of night, their engines muffled with tarps. Artillery units dug gun pits into the sodden ground, and infantrymen crouched in ditches, soaked through and waiting for the signal to advance. Everyone knew this was going to be a decisive test. On the morning of June the 26th, the attack began. Just after dawn, hundreds of guns opened fire in unison, shaking the ground like an earthquake. The bombardment rolled ahead of the advancing infantry, creeping forward minute by minute. Behind it came the men of the 15th Scottish Division, kilts damp with rain, rifles gripped tight, faces streaked with mud. They surged across the fields west of Caen under the whine of shells and the crash of mortars. German artillery responded immediately, and within minutes the open ground became a killing field. The Scots pressed on, crossing the Odon River near the village of Tourville. Engineers struggled to throw bridges across the water under fire, while machine guns rattled from farmhouses on the opposite bank. When the first bridgehead was finally secured, British armour began to pour across, Sherman tanks rumbling forward, their tracks splattering mud in every direction. But the enemy was waiting. The 12th SS Panzer Division, veterans of earlier clashes with the Canadians, counterattacked with precision. Tiger tanks rolled from hidden positions on the hills beyond the river, their 88mm guns firing with deadly accuracy. The first wave of British armour took heavy losses. Yet despite the mounting casualties, the offensive pressed forward. Every ridge, every cluster of trees became a miniature battlefield. Soldiers fought room to room in shattered villages, tossing grenades through windows, advancing behind walls of smoke. By the end of the first day, the British had driven several miles into the German lines. The villages of Choux and Granville-sur-Odon were in their hands, and the high ground at Hill 112, an unassuming rise southwest of Caen, was within reach. That hill would become one of the most contested pieces of land in all of Normandy. From its crest, the entire battlefield could be seen, the shimmering line of the Orne River, the smoke rising over Caen, and the endless flow of men and machines grinding toward one another. Whoever held Hill 112 would command the terrain. The next morning, the 11th Armoured Division moved to seize it. As dawn broke, the countryside erupted in smoke and flame. British tanks advanced in tight formation, their guns firing into the mist. German artillery zeroed in almost immediately. Shells fell among the tanks, tearing open turrets and hurling men from their vehicles. The wheat fields burned, filling the air with a choking haze that blinded gunners and made friend indistinguishable from foe. Through that chaos, small groups of infantry advanced alongside the armour, picking their way through craters and hedgerows, exchanging fire with German paratroopers dug in among the ruins of farmhouses. By midday, the leading elements had reached the slopes of Hill 112. The fight for the summit was savage. Machine guns barked from the tree line, while mortars rained down from behind the crest. One officer later recalled that the air itself seemed to vibrate from the constant concussion of shells. Casualties mounted quickly. Tanks burned where they stalled, crews trapped inside as ammunition ignited. Yet inch by inch the British climbed the hill, the enemy giving ground only when overrun. For 2 days, the battle raged across the ridges and valleys of the Odon. German forces launched counterattack after counterattack, armoured columns surging through smoke to try to throw the British back. The 9th SS Panzer Division joined the fray, driving forward in waves of black-uniformed troops. British artillery and rocket batteries fired continuously, the noise so relentless that soldiers began shouting to make themselves heard even after the guns fell silent. By June 29th, Montgomery had achieved what he wanted. Every German Panzer division in Normandy had been drawn into the fight around Caen. Epsom had not broken through, but it had succeeded in draining the enemy's strength. German commanders committed their last mobile reserves to stem the British advance, leaving the western flank thinly held. The stage was being set for the Americans to launch their own breakout, though the men at the Odon could hardly know it. Amid the noise and exhaustion, the soldiers began to understand the scale of the battle they were trapped in. For the infantry slogging through mud and rubble, this was a world reduced to immediate sensations: the metallic taste of cordite, the sting of smoke in the eyes, the wet weight of gear that never seemed to dry. The hedgerows hid snipers and machine gun nests, and every bend in the road might conceal a waiting tank. There was no open front line, only a series of deadly pockets, each fought for by small groups of men whose courage and endurance carried the day. In the villages behind the lines, the cost was evident. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded, stretchers lined the roads leading back to the coast, and columns of ambulances moved constantly between the front and the beachhead. Chaplains performed burials in fields still echoing with artillery fire. The weather turned again, washing the blood and dust into the soil. Normandy's summer harvest would never come. By early July, Operation Epsom was over. The offensive had gained ground, but Caen still stood defiant. The British had advanced nearly 6 miles and secured a firm bridgehead across the Odon, yet the high ground beyond remained in German hands. Montgomery's army had taken around 4,000 casualties. In return, the Germans had lost nearly as many, along with hundreds of tanks and guns. The front was beginning to creak under the weight of attrition, but no one on either side could claim victory. Hill 112, the centerpiece of the fight, had become a symbol of the entire struggle for Caen, a place where bravery and futility seemed to meet. Neither side could hold it for long. Every time it was taken, it was shelled into submission again. One British tanker later said that looking down from the summit was like gazing across the surface of the moon, cratered and lifeless. It was clear that the battle for Caen would not be won by a single push. It would require overwhelming force, artillery, air power, and the grim determination to erase every German position from the map. As the guns fell silent in early July, the soldiers prepared for yet another assault. Supplies were brought forward. Fresh divisions took over exhausted positions. The next plan, bigger and more devastating than anything before, was already being drawn up at Montgomery's headquarters. Caen had resisted for nearly a month, but the Allies were gathering strength for an operation that would leave the city forever changed. The British commanders named it after a small village to the north of the city, Charnwood. By early July, the plains north of Caen had become a scarred graveyard of wrecks and craters. Smoke drifted constantly over the horizon where the city stood, and the air stank of oil and cordite. The last weeks of fighting had drawn in every German reserve in Normandy, yet Caen remained a fortress. For Montgomery, the time for patience was over. Operation Charnwood would bring the full weight of British and Canadian strength against the city itself. The goal was clear: drive the Germans out, seize the Orne River crossings, and bring an end to a siege that had lasted for more than a month. The soldiers preparing for Charnwood knew something enormous was coming. Behind the front lines, thousands of guns were wheeled into position. Artillerymen stacked shells in neat pyramids, ready for a barrage that would dwarf anything the Germans had yet faced. The Royal Air Force assembled hundreds of bombers at airfields across southern England, and in the shattered villages north of Caen, British and Canadian divisions waited in silence, staring toward the spires that rose like ghosts through the haze. On the night of July 7th, 1944, the sky over Normandy changed forever. Just before midnight, the hum of engines began to build. Over 400 heavy bombers crossed the coastline, their navigation lights glinting faintly above the clouds. Locals who had endured weeks of shellfire stopped in their shelters, listening to the distant thunder grow louder. Then the darkness turned to flame. The first bombs fell on Caen's northern quarters, districts still held by the 12th SS Panzer Division and remnants of the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division. The bombardment was unlike anything seen since the invasion began. Lancasters and Halifaxes dropped nearly 2,500 tons of explosives in less than an hour, shaking the earth for miles. Entire streets were erased in seconds. Windows shattered 20 miles away, and the firestorm illuminated the night like dawn. For the German defenders, there was no refuge. Positions that had been carefully fortified for weeks were buried under rubble. Tanks overturned in their pits. Communication lines vanished in the chaos. When the bombing ended, a strange silence followed. Only the crackle of fires and the low groan of the wounded broke the stillness. Allied troops moved to their start lines as artillery batteries opened up behind them. The thunder of guns rolled across the countryside as dawn approached on July 8th. At first light, the British Second Army began its advance. 3 divisions moved forward, the 3rd Infantry Division on the right, the 59th, Staffordshire, in the centre, and the 3rd Canadian Division on the left. Ahead of them lay 3 miles of devastated ground, villages flattened by bombing, orchards splintered into stumps, and craters so deep that tanks struggled to cross. The land was still burning when the first waves went in. In the centre, the 59th Division advanced through what was left of Saint-Contesse. Smoke obscured the sky, and the air was so thick with dust that men could barely see the next field. The Germans had regrouped among the ruins, turning collapsed walls and broken rail cars into strong points. Every step forward demanded another burst of fire and another charge across open ground. The Staffordshire battalions fought through cellars and courtyards, clearing one building at a time. The noise was overwhelming. Rifles, mortars, and the constant rumble of British tanks crawling forward to support the infantry. On the right flank, the 3rd British Division pushed toward Lebesey Wood, where SS Panzer Grenadiers had entrenched themselves. The woodland had been shelled for days, yet the defenders remained. As the British advanced, machine guns opened up from hidden positions, cutting through the morning haze. It was a battle fought at terrifyingly close range. Riflemen threw grenades into bunkers, and flamethrower teams followed, forcing the enemy from cover. By mid-morning, the forest was ablaze. The ground was blackened, but the path to the city's northern suburbs was finally open. To the west, the Canadians were locked in their own brutal struggle. Their objective was the outskirts of Authie and Burren, villages that had become synonymous with bloodshed during earlier clashes with the 12th SS. The Canadians advanced behind a rolling barrage that flattened what little still stood. German resistance was desperate but fragmented. With every bombardment, the defenders were pushed farther south, clinging to the ruins. By noon, Canadian tanks of the 2nd Armoured Brigade were pushing into the northern edge of Caen itself. The city was within reach. Behind the lines, the scale of destruction became clear. The once bustling university district, the factories along the Orne, and the neighbourhoods beyond were reduced to skeletons of brick and stone. Fires raged unchecked. Columns of refugees moved through the outskirts, men, women, and children carrying whatever they could salvage. Some emerged from cellars where they had been trapped for days, blinking into a daylight filled with smoke. Others sought out British soldiers, begging for food or directions to safety. The soldiers gave what rations they could spare, many visibly shaken by what they saw. By late afternoon, the British line had advanced deep into northern Caen. The German defence began to collapse under the combined weight of artillery and armour. The SS divisions fell back across the Orne, leaving behind pockets of resistance that fought until the last round. In one street, a Churchill tank fired point-blank into a barricade of rubble. In another, Canadian riflemen fought through a maze of burning houses, the glow of flames reflecting off their bayonets. At 8 p.m, Montgomery received word that the northern half of Caen was in Allied hands. His staff marked the progress on a map pinned to a tent wall. The line now ran through the centre of the city. It had taken over a month since D-Day, but Caen, at least in part, was finally captured. The victory, however, came at a dreadful price. When night fell on July 8th, the sky over Caen glowed red. The bombardment had ignited everything that could burn, and the heat was so intense that streets glowed faintly in the darkness. Soldiers dug in among the ruins as artillery duels continued across the river. From the far bank, German guns hammered the new British positions. The Orne now separated two exhausted armies, both unwilling to yield. In the early hours of July 9th, patrols reported that the Germans were withdrawing. The order had come from higher command. Hitler had authorized a retreat to the southern bank, where the 1st SS Panzer Division and remnants of the 12th SS would regroup for the next defense line. When British troops entered the deserted sectors at dawn, they found only rubble and silence. The streets were unrecognizable. Caen's northern districts were gone. The morning after the battle brought scenes of devastation unlike anything the Allied soldiers had yet witnessed. Entire neighbourhoods were flattened. Churches that had stood for centuries were piles of stone. In the ruins of the Abbaye aux Hommes, civilians crawled out from cellars, dazed and covered in dust. The survivors spoke of nights spent in darkness, of homes collapsing around them, of families separated in the chaos. Among the rubble, British engineers began clearing routes for ambulances and bulldozers. Aid stations were set up in what remained of the city squares, where medics tended to civilians and soldiers alike. For Montgomery and his commanders, Charnwood was a success. The northern half of Caen had fallen, and the Germans had been forced across the Orne. The operation had cost over 3,000 Allied casualties, but it had broken the stalemate that had gripped the front since D-Day. Strategically, it meant more than ground gained. It meant the enemy's defences were finally cracking. Yet as the soldiers looked out across the smoking city, victory felt hollow. The Caen they had fought so hard to reach was a ruin. That night, the guns fell silent for the first time in weeks. Men slept in shell holes, among the wrecks of their tanks, or in the ruins of houses where families had once lived. Overhead, the fires continued to burn, painting the sky in shades of orange and grey. Caen had been won, but the war for its southern approaches was already beginning to stir. Across the river, the Germans were regrouping on higher ground, preparing for the next Allied assault. The battles to come, Atlantic and Goodwood, would test the exhausted armies once again. For the moment, though, the men of Charnwood could only look upon what they had taken and understand the price of their achievement. The city was free, yet shattered beyond recognition. And as dawn rose over the ruins on July 10th, the road south toward the Orne River awaited the next advance. The capture of northern Caen under Operation Charnwood had finally broken the stalemate that had gripped Normandy for over a month. Yet victory brought no rest. The southern half of the city, an industrial sprawl of factories, rail yards and suburbs along the Orne River, remained firmly in German hands. Across the shattered bridges, the SS still occupied the high ground of the Bourguebus Ridge and the villages beyond, forming a new defensive wall. The battle for Caen was far from finished. What Charnwood had begun, the Canadians were now ordered to complete. In the days following the bombing, the northern half of the city was an inferno. Columns of black smoke hung in the air like storm clouds, drifting slowly south. The rubble still smouldered, and the sharp scent of burned metal and fuel clung to everything. British and Canadian engineers cleared paths through the wreckage, bulldozing debris to make way for tanks and trucks. Civilians wandered through the ruins, silent and hollow-eyed, clutching what little remained of their homes. Through this landscape moved the men of the 2nd Canadian Corps, preparing for their most important operation yet. Their commander, Lieutenant General Guy Simons, had a reputation for precision and iron discipline. His objective was to cross the Orne, capture the southern districts of Caen, and push the German line back to the Verrières Ridge. The operation would begin at dawn on July 18, 1944, under the codename Atlantic. Simons planned his assault carefully. The attack would be led by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by armour from the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade and heavy artillery. To the east, British forces of the 2nd Army would launch their own offensive, Operation Goodwood, creating a thunderous twin blow against the German line. For the Canadians, the mission was as symbolic as it was strategic. The fight for Caen had cost their divisions dearly, and now they would be the ones to raise their flag over its southern bank. The night before the attack was restless. Rain fell in thin sheets, soaking uniforms and clogging weapons with mud. Along the riverbank, engineers assembled pontoon bridges in silence, each plank lowered into place with the caution of men who knew that one sound might bring artillery fire. In the darkness, officers moved quietly among the troops, offering last words of encouragement. Many of the soldiers had landed on Juno Beach 6 weeks earlier. Now, those who had survived that day prepared for another test. At dawn, the bombardment began. The eastern sky glowed pale as hundreds of Allied guns opened up, pounding the German positions south of Caen. The air shuddered under the concussion of the barrage. Columns of earth rose high above the river as explosions rolled one after another, merging into a single unbroken roar. It was the heaviest artillery concentration the Canadians had yet commanded. Within minutes, the far bank disappeared beneath a wall of dust and smoke. Then came the signal to move. Assault companies of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment advanced across the river, the pontoon bridges trembling under their boots. Behind them, tanks clattered across hastily laid steel tracks. German guns opened fire, and shells crashed into the water, sending fountains of spray into the air. Several bridges were hit, collapsing into the current. Even so, wave after wave of infantry pushed on, some wading through waist-deep water where crossings had failed. By sheer momentum, the Canadians gained the opposite shore. The first objectives lay in the industrial quarter of Colombelle, a labyrinth of factories and rail yards. The bombardment had torn the area apart, but German machine guns still raked the streets from surviving buildings. Smoke lay thick between the ruins as the Canadians fought their way forward. Flamethrower teams cleared strongpoints while tanks rolled through twisted iron gates, crushing wreckage beneath their treads. The clang of metal echoed against the walls of shattered warehouses, punctuated by the thunder of gunfire. Every corner seemed to conceal danger. By mid-morning, the Canadians had secured Colombelles and pushed toward Faubourg de Vaucelles, the southern district of the city. The resistance here was even more determined. The remnants of the 21st Panzer Division and 1st SS Panzer Corps had dug in around crossroads and intersections, their positions linked by tunnels and sewers. The Canadians advanced through what had once been the industrial heart of Caen, now transformed into a wasteland of rubble and flame. The fighting became chaotic. Squads isolated, tanks maneuvering blindly through smoke-filled streets. Radio signals broke up under the interference of the city's dense ruins. Officers led from the front, often with pistols drawn, directing men by gesture rather than words. The air was filled with dust, choking and hot. One Canadian soldier later recalled that visibility had fallen to a few yards, and the sound of gunfire never stopped, one long continuous crash of noise that seemed to consume the city itself. As the battle spread southward, the Canadians encountered a series of well-prepared defences along the approaches to the Orne's southern bridges. German artillery, positioned on the far ridges, poured fire into the streets below. Shells slammed into the city with rhythmic precision, collapsing walls already weakened by bombing. Yet the Canadians kept advancing, weaving through side streets, using the ruins themselves for cover. To the west, British units from the 3rd Infantry Division joined the attack, clearing what remained of the city's southern outskirts. Cooperation between the two armies was seamless now, forged through weeks of hard fighting. The British artillery covered the flanks, while the Canadians spearheaded the main push. Every gain was costly, but by early afternoon the enemy line was bending. Reports filtered in that German formations were beginning to fall back toward the Borgebus Ridge. By late afternoon, Simons ordered his armoured brigades forward. Columns of Sherman tanks and self-propelled guns rolled into the open ground beyond the city. Their treads crushed the remnants of railway tracks and debris as they moved into position. Smoke from burning fuel depots rose behind them in towering columns. From the ridge ahead, German tanks began firing, their rounds screaming down into the plain. The clash of armour echoed across the fields, an unending exchange of shells and machine gun bursts that sent plumes of dirt and fire into the sky. The Canadians held firm, using artillery and air support to silence the worst of the opposition. Typhoon fighter bombers swooped low, firing rockets into the ridges, leaving black scars across the earth. The sound of their engines rolled like thunder over the battlefield. Within hours, the southern suburbs of Caen were clear, and Canadian troops had secured the river crossings. At 7 p.m., Simons's headquarters received confirmation. The city of Caen was finally under Allied control. From the high ground to the south, the German army still clung to the ridge, but the city itself, every bridge, every quarter, was free. For the first time in over 4 years, the tricolour of France fluttered once more above the ruins. The men who had fought through those ruins were too tired to celebrate. Many simply sat down where they stood, leaning against walls that barely remained upright. Medics moved among them, tending to wounds by the light of burning buildings. The streets were filled with the sounds of weeping civilians, the creak of stretchers, and the low rumble of tanks returning from the line. When dawn broke the next morning, the devastation was staggering. The Orne River glistened under a sky still streaked with smoke. Entire districts were flattened. The air smelled of dust and ash, and the silence after days of battle was almost unbearable. Yet amid the wreckage, the people of Caen began to emerge. They stepped cautiously into the open, blinking against the daylight, some waving small French flags they had hidden since the occupation began. Soldiers handed out water and rations, offering what little comfort they could. For the Canadians, Operation Atlantic had achieved its purpose. The southern half of Caen had fallen, and the enemy was withdrawing toward the next defensive line. The victory came at a terrible cost. Hundreds of Canadians killed or wounded, many of them veterans of Juno Beach who had fought without rest since June. Yet their perseverance had broken the German grip on the city completely. As Simon surveyed the smoking skyline that evening, he knew that the battle for Caen had changed. The city was gone, but the door to the south was open. The next challenge would be the ridges beyond, the rolling fields where the German Panzers waited to counterattack. Ahead, lay the greatest armoured clash of the British campaign, a battle that would test everything the Allies had learned since D-Day. The name of that next storm was already written in Montgomery's orders: Operation Goodwood. The smoke from Caen's ruins had hardly cleared when the next storm began to gather. On the maps in Montgomery's headquarters, the front line now stretched along the Orne River, beyond which rose the Borgebus Ridge, a long, shallow elevation that dominated the flat plains east of Caen. From there, the German guns could observe every Allied movement. To break through Normandy's eastern front, the ridge had to fall. The plan was vast, ambitious, and audacious in scale. Its name would soon become legend: Operation Goodwood. In the days following the Canadians' capture of southern Caen, British engineers worked tirelessly to prepare for the new offensive. Bridges were built under the cover of darkness across the Orne and its tributaries, strong enough to carry waves of armour. Fields were cleared of mines, tracks were marked, and ammunition dumps stocked to bursting. The soldiers on the ground sensed what was coming, an attack unlike any before. Rumours spread among the ranks that this would be the largest armoured assault ever attempted by the British Army. The weather in mid-July was oppressive. The air hung heavy with heat, carrying the bitter scent of burning fuel from the city behind the lines. Across open ground near the villages of Ranville and Banneville, columns of tanks assembled in silence. The rumble of their engines was muffled under canvas covers, the glint of their hulls disguised with netting and dust. Crews checked every detail: fuel lines, radio sets, ammunition stores. Each man knew that once they crossed the Orne, there would be no retreat. Shortly after dawn on July 18th, the sky began to vibrate with the hum of approaching aircraft. The men below looked up to see a sight that dwarfed anything they had witnessed before: hundreds of bombers stretching from horizon to horizon. The air thundered as the formations passed overhead, their shadows racing across the fields. At precisely 6:40 a.m., the first wave released its bombs. The bombardment was beyond imagination. Over 1,000 heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces dropped nearly 6,000 tons of explosives on the German positions east of Caen. Villages like Cagny, Émierville, and Frénouville vanished in seconds. The ground shook like a living thing. Trees snapped like twigs, and walls of dust and fire rolled across the countryside. Soldiers waiting to advance could feel the heat of the explosions on their faces even miles away. For nearly 2 hours, the bombing continued without pause, followed by the roar of naval guns and the steady crash of field artillery. When the barrage lifted, a vast silence settled. Then came the order every tank crew had been waiting for: advance! The armoured spearhead of 8th Corps moved out of the dust cloud, over 400 tanks abreast. At the front were the Guards Armoured Division and the 11th Armoured Division, with the 7th Armoured Division following in support. The sight was almost unreal: a sea of steel crawling across the open plains, sunlight flashing off turrets and barrels as they rolled toward the German lines. For a brief moment, it seemed as if nothing could stop them. The German front appeared obliterated, the air still thick with smoke from the bombardment. Sherman and Cromwell tanks surged forward at full throttle, crushing through what had once been hedgerows and farm walls. Behind them came waves of infantry, advancing through shell holes and churned earth. But as the columns pushed deeper into the plain, the illusion began to fade. Hidden beneath the rubble and smoke, the German defences were still alive. The 1st SS Panzer Division, supported by elements of the 21st Panzer, had survived the bombing in deep trenches and concrete bunkers. As the British tanks approached within range, German anti-tank guns opened fire. The first salvo tore through the lead vehicles, setting them ablaze in seconds. Within minutes, the battlefield was alive again. Flashes of muzzle fire, plumes of smoke, the metallic clatter of engines labouring under stress. The fighting quickly descended into chaos. Dust from the bombardment reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. Radio communications broke down amid the interference of the explosions. Tank commanders navigated by instinct, steering toward the sound of enemy fire. The flat terrain, which had seemed ideal for armour, now offered no cover. German 88mm guns dug into the slopes of the Bourgebus ridge, fired with terrifying accuracy. Each hit sent a column of black smoke twisting into the sky. By mid-morning, the advance had slowed. The Guards' armoured division became entangled near the village of Cagny, where hidden German guns knocked out tank after tank from point-blank range. One British officer described the scene as a metallic graveyard, the wrecks burning so fiercely that ammunition inside detonated for hours. Yet the offensive pressed on. Behind the front line, artillery continued to hammer the ridge, and fighter bombers streaked overhead, their rockets cutting through the haze. To the west, the 11th Armoured Division managed to break through toward Brass and Hubert-Follier. They advanced through fields littered with wrecks, manoeuvring between burning craters. Every few hundred yards, new resistance flared. Snipers in church towers, machine gun nests hidden among the ruins. The British infantry, advancing behind the tanks, cleared each position in turn, leaving the ground smoking in their wake. By afternoon, the battlefield had become a furnace. The summer sun beat down on the metal hulls until they were almost too hot to touch. Inside the tanks, temperatures rose unbearably, and crews fought through exhaustion and heat. The air inside the turrets stank of sweat, fuel, and gunpowder. Still, the orders were to keep advancing. German commanders recognized the danger and threw everything they had into the fight. Reserve panzer units counterattacked along the flanks, striking at the British columns from hidden positions. In one desperate engagement near Émiville, British and German tanks fought at ranges so close that the crews could see each other's faces through the smoke. The fields were littered with craters and wrecks, yet neither side relented. By the evening of July 18th, 8th Corps had advanced nearly 7 miles, a remarkable achievement given the scale of the resistance. The momentum, however, was faltering. The ridge still loomed ahead, held by a stubborn mix of SS and Panzer Grenadier units. That night, the horizon glowed red with burning villages, and the dull rumble of artillery rolled on without pause. Men slept inside their tanks or dug into shell holes, too exhausted to eat. At first light on July 19th, the offensive resumed. The 11th Armoured Division made another push toward Bourgebus, supported by the Royal Air Force and massed artillery. The attack began well, but soon bogged down under a hail of anti-tank fire. German defences, though battered, were relentless. The ridge was a natural fortress, a rise of open fields, every slope registered for artillery fire. As British tanks crested the high ground, German guns tore into them. Smoke and dust turned the morning into twilight. Through that day and the next, the struggle continued. Every mile gained came at tremendous cost. British gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Mechanics worked through the night to repair damaged vehicles. The air reeked of burning fuel, and the sound of shells crashing into the ridge never stopped. By July 20th, Montgomery called a halt. The British had taken ground, enough to secure the eastern approaches to Caen, but the ridge remained in enemy hands. Over 4,000 men were casualties, and nearly 500 tanks were destroyed or disabled. Yet strategically, the operation had achieved its purpose. The German armoured divisions were shattered, their reserves spent. From this moment on, the Wehrmacht in Normandy would be fighting defensively, its initiative gone forever. For the soldiers who survived Goodwood, the memory was seared into their minds. The endless plain, the wall of smoke, the terrible thunder of guns that seemed to swallow the world. The operation became a testament to endurance, to courage under fire, and to the sheer scale of modern warfare. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield lay still. Across the fields east of Caen, hundreds of tanks sat broken and blackened under the summer sun. The Bourguebus ridge was still scarred with trenches and craters, but the enemy's grip on Normandy had been broken. The British Second Army now stood poised to push farther south, and the Allies' great breakout was within reach. The soldiers knew the cost, and few spoke as they returned to their lines. Behind them, the fires of Goodwood smouldered in the haze, marking both a victory and a graveyard. Ahead lay the task of rebuilding, of tending to the wounded, and preparing for what came next. The city behind them was free, but the land around it bore the full weight of war's fury. Soon the guns would turn toward Falaise, and the closing of the trap that would destroy the German army in Normandy. The thunder of Operation Goodwood faded slowly into silence, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of another world. Caen, once the heart of Normandy, lay beneath a haze of smoke and dust. From the Bourguebus ridge to the River Orne, the ground was littered with the skeletons of tanks, broken bridges, and the remnants of a city that had endured 6 relentless weeks of war. The Allies had finally secured Caen in full, yet the triumph felt hollow. There was no city left to celebrate in, only ruins where homes had stood, and silence where laughter had once echoed. The soldiers who entered the southern districts of Caen after Goodwood found a place almost unrecognizable. Streets that had once been alive with the sounds of trams and markets were now rubble-strewn trenches. Walls leaned at impossible angles, their bricks blackened by fire. Trees that had lined the boulevards were splintered stumps. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, oil, and something far worse, the lingering smell of death that came from collapsed basements where hundreds of civilians had taken shelter during the bombing. As the dust settled, the enormity of what had been lost began to take shape. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. From the industrial zones along the river to the historic heart of the city, little remained intact. The Abbey of Saint-Étienne, founded by William the Conqueror nearly 9 centuries earlier, stood scorched but miraculously upright amid the devastation. For the French survivors, its survival felt symbolic, a fragment of their heritage left standing amid the ruin. British and Canadian units were among the first to move through the wreckage, their tanks crawling carefully over streets that had turned into mazes of debris. Combat engineers led the way, checking for mines and unexploded shells buried beneath the rubble. Where bridges had collapsed, they built makeshift crossings out of timber and steel. Those who had fought through the chaos of Goodwood now found themselves tasked with something equally vital, restoring life to a place that had been almost erased. Amid the wreckage, civilians began to emerge from the shadows. Many had spent weeks underground, surviving on whatever food they could scavenge. They blinked in disbelief at what remained of their city, walking slowly among the ruins, searching for familiar landmarks that no longer existed. A woman picked her way through the wreck of her home, pausing to collect a single unbroken photograph. An elderly man, covered in dust, sat on the steps of what had once been a church, clutching a rosary that had somehow survived the bombardment. The British and Canadian soldiers, hardened by weeks of fighting, were struck by the quiet dignity of the survivors. In the midst of this desolation, moments of compassion shone through. Soldiers shared their rations, helped dig survivors out of collapsed cellars, and set up makeshift aid posts in half-destroyed schools. Medics treated civilians alongside the wounded of both armies. The war had drawn deep lines between nations, but in Caen, humanity persisted even among the ashes. As the front line moved south, the work of reconstruction began almost immediately. Montgomery's engineers arrived in force, accompanied by French volunteers and local officials. Their first priority was the roads. Without them, supplies could not reach the front. Bulldozers cleared the main arteries leading through the city, pushing aside rubble and wrecked vehicles. Within days, new routes had been cut through the ruins, allowing convoys of trucks and tanks to roll towards the Orne bridges and beyond. The Orne River itself, choked with wreckage, became a symbol of renewal. The Canadians who had fought along its banks now laboured to build new bridges, their work illuminated by the flickering light of fires still burning in the distance. Each new crossing was christened with a name that carried meaning: Churchill, Winston, Monty's Bridge. These structures, temporary as they were, restored movement to an army that needed to keep advancing and to a city that needed to reconnect with the world. In the days that followed, military engineers joined forces with the people of Caen to restore basic order. Power lines were strung through the rubble and generators were brought in to light the surviving hospitals. Water trucks rolled through the streets, distributing what little could be spared. The work was dangerous. Unexploded bombs and unstable buildings claimed more lives even after the battle had ended, yet the reconstruction went on with quiet determination. The Allies also faced the grim duty of clearing the dead. Across Caen's shattered streets and the fields beyond, thousands of soldiers, British, Canadian and German, lay where they had fallen. Graves registration units worked in silence, marking temporary resting places with simple wooden crosses. The civilians of Caen did the same for their neighbours, creating small cemeteries in gardens, courtyards, and the ruins of churches. The city had become both battlefield and burial ground. From above, Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed the scene, a city of grey dust and empty squares, its bridges twisted, its riverbanks scorched. To military planners, those images represented progress. Caen was in Allied hands, the eastern flank secured, and the German Panzer divisions forced into retreat. Yet to those who walked its streets, it was a place haunted by memory. Every corner carried a story of loss: the home destroyed, the friend buried beneath rubble, the family that never returned. For Montgomery and his commanders, Caen's fall was a strategic victory. It marked the end of the first phase of the Normandy Campaign. The city's capture allowed the Allies to anchor their supply lines, enabling the next great offensive that would sweep across France. The Germans had poured their strength into defending Caen, and in doing so had been broken. Still, for the men who fought there, triumph came tinged with melancholy. They had taken the city, but its soul seemed to have been sacrificed in the process. As the days passed, life began to reassert itself. Market stalls appeared amid the ruins, their tables improvised from doors, salvaged from wrecked homes. French women, their dresses still covered in dust, gathered what fruit and vegetables they could find to sell to soldiers passing through. Children played beside burned-out tanks, their laughter carrying faintly through the shattered streets. For the first time in months, there was music again. A lone accordion played in the evening outside what remained of a cafe. The melody rose softly, fragile yet defiant, echoing through the hollowed heart of Caen. The returning French authorities, led by members of the resistance, established their headquarters in one of the few intact buildings. They coordinated with Allied officers to restore civic order, distribute aid, and identify collaborators. The tricolour flag, hidden away since 1940, was raised over the town hall to the cheers of those who gathered in the square. For the people of Caen, the sight was more than symbolic. It was a promise that, though the city was broken, France herself would endure. Even among the ruins, work continued ceaselessly. Hospitals overflowed and food remained scarce, yet the determination of the survivors was unshakable. Builders salvaged stone from collapsed walls to begin new homes. Churches held open-air services amid the rubble, their congregations standing where pews had once been. Caen's cathedral bells, long silenced by the occupation and the war, were repaired and rang out again before the month's end. The sound rolled across the desolate city like a benediction. By early August, the Allied front had moved far to the south. The battle for Normandy was entering its final act, but Caen would remain a scar on the landscape, a reminder of what liberation cost. For every soldier who passed through its ruins on the way to Falaise or Paris, the city served as both warning and inspiration. War could destroy, but it could not erase courage or the will to rebuild. At night, the fires finally began to fade. The skies cleared, revealing stars over the Orne River. In those quiet hours, engineers worked by lantern light, rebuilding the bridges they had once fought to destroy. The soldiers watched from their camps on the outskirts, knowing that what had been won here would shape the rest of the war. Caen had fallen, and with its fall came the foundation of victory. The Allied armies stood ready to advance into the heart of France. Yet behind them, in the still smoking city, something just as powerful was beginning to rise, the spirit of renewal that no bomb could extinguish. The next chapter in Normandy's story would be written to the south, where the remnants of Hitler's army were being driven towards the trap at Falaise. The war was moving on, but the memory of Caen, its sacrifice, its endurance, and its rebirth would remain forever carved into the heart of history. When the guns finally fell silent over Caen, the echoes of battle lingered long after the armies had moved on. The city had been liberated, yet its liberation carried the deep shadow of destruction. Rubble and ash replaced stone and slate, and the Orne River reflected not the light of street lamps, but the fires that still smouldered along its banks. Caen had become a monument to endurance, a city both destroyed and reborn through sacrifice. Its legacy would stretch far beyond the Normandy Campaign, shaping how the world remembered the price of victory. By August 1944, the Allied armies were already pressing south toward Falaise and beyond, but the scars of Caen remained etched into the hearts of those who had fought there. Soldiers spoke of the battle in tones of quiet reverence, as if it had taken place in another world altogether, a place where every field and street corner demanded courage beyond imagination. Veterans of the British Second Army and the Canadian Corps would forever recall Caen as a crucible, a test that burned away all illusions about war. For historians and commanders, the lessons were immediate and sobering. The fight for Caen had revealed the nature of modern warfare with unflinching clarity. It was no longer a contest of rapid movement or single decisive blows, but of endurance, firepower, and logistics. The struggle that began on D-Day and culminated in the city's capture showed how even the best-laid plans could drown in mud, smoke, and blood. Every inch gained had come at the cost of lives, time, and immense destruction. Yet the victory, though bitter, was vital. The capture of Caen anchored the Allied line and unhinged the German defence across Normandy. By forcing Hitler's panzer divisions to commit their strength to the city, Montgomery achieved the strategic diversion that allowed the Americans to break out to the west at Saint-Lô. Caen, for all its suffering, had become the hinge upon which the campaign turned. When the Allies finally closed the Falaise pocket weeks later, trapping and destroying much of the German army in France, the road to Paris and beyond was open. The soldiers who fought through Caen understood that their ordeal had been the foundation of that success. Yet for the men who survived, victory in Caen was measured less in maps and strategy than in memory. They remembered the faces of comrades lost amid the hedgerows and rubble, the cries of the wounded echoing through the ruins, and the strange silence that followed when the shooting stopped. In letters home, many struggled to describe what they had seen. The destruction defied language. One Canadian officer wrote, "There is no city here anymore, only a skeleton." And yet among the ruins, the people still walk. Those people, the citizens of Caen, became symbols of resilience for the liberated world. In the weeks after the battle, they began to rebuild in the only way possible, one stone at a time. The Allies provided food, tools, and construction materials, while French volunteers cleared debris by hand. Temporary shelters rose from the ruins, fashioned from tarpaulin and scavenged timber. Children who had spent months in cellars returned to the streets, their laughter mingling with the clatter of hammers. Slowly, the heartbeat of the city returned. Among the Allied troops who remained to assist in the reconstruction, an unspoken bond formed with the people they had freed. Soldiers who had fought through Caen's streets now helped to repair them. Engineers who had blown bridges in battle built new ones for peace. Many returned years later, long after the war, to see the city they once knew in flames, now standing again in light. They were greeted with open arms by those who remembered their kindness during those dark weeks. As peace returned, the memory of Caen began to crystallize into something enduring. The city became a living memorial to the cost of liberation. Monuments were raised not to glorify the battle, but to honor those who had fallen, soldiers and civilians alike. In cemeteries north and south of the city, row upon row of white crosses stretched toward the horizon. British, Canadian, and German graves lay side by side, each marking a life claimed by the same brutal struggle. Visitors would walk among them in silence, listening to the wind that rustled through the grass as if carrying the whispers of the past. The reconstruction of Caen took years. Architects and planners faced the immense challenge of rebuilding a medieval city from near total destruction. Their task was not merely to replace what had been lost, but to preserve its spirit. The decision was made to restore the great abbeys of William the Conqueror and Queen Matilda exactly as they had stood before the war. Craftsmen from across France volunteered their labor, carving new stone by hand and fitting it into walls that had once echoed with explosions. Every repaired arch and rebuilt spire became a statement of defiance, a declaration that history itself could be reborn from ruin. By the early 1950s, Caen had regained its pulse. Modern buildings rose alongside reconstructed landmarks, symbolizing both memory and renewal. The scars of war remained visible, preserved intentionally in certain places as reminders of what had happened there. The people refused to let the memory fade. Each July, the city marked the anniversary of its liberation with ceremonies attended by veterans, families and officials from across the world. Flags of Britain and Canada flew alongside the French tricolour, a testament to the unity forged in fire. For the Allied nations, Caen's legacy extended beyond France. The battle shaped military doctrine for generations to come. The importance of coordination between air, armour and infantry, the lessons of urban warfare, and the necessity of compassion amid conquest. All were learned at terrible cost in those weeks between June and July 1944. Every major offensive that followed, from the crossing of the Seine to the assault on the Rhine, carried within it the imprint of Caen's lessons. Yet even as history books recorded the statistics of victory, the human dimension endured most strongly. Veterans who visited the city decades later found themselves overcome with emotion. The streets were alive again, children played where tanks once burned, and the Orne flowed peacefully beneath rebuilt bridges. For many, it was impossible to reconcile these scenes with their memories of gunfire and ash. One British sergeant, returning in 1964, stood before the rebuilt Abbaye aux Hommes and whispered, "It was worth it after all." The people of Caen never forgot the soldiers who had freed them. Plaques appeared on street corners bearing the names of fallen regiments. Schools were named after Allied units, and each year the citizens tended the graves of the men who had died for their city. The relationships formed in those days of liberation endured across generations. Families that had sheltered soldiers or received aid from them kept their photographs, their letters, their medals, personal relics of shared endurance. As time passed, the Battle of Caen came to represent more than a single city's liberation. It embodied the moral paradox of modern war, the necessity of destruction to achieve freedom, the coexistence of courage and tragedy. The city became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand that balance. Students, historians, and travelers from around the world walked its streets, tracing the routes once taken by tanks and infantry, visiting the museums and memorials built to preserve its story. Each found their own meaning in the ruins that had become foundations for peace. Today, Caen stands as both a modern city and a memorial to the resilience of humanity. Its skyline, once consumed by smoke, now gleams with new towers and restored spires. Yet beneath the cobblestones and gardens lie layers of history. The memory of those 6 relentless weeks when an ancient city became the focal point of the modern world's greatest war. The people who live there walk on ground sanctified by sacrifice. In every sense, Caen remains a crucible. It forged unity between nations, tested the endurance of armies, and revealed the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to surrender to despair. The city's story endures not because of its destruction, but because of what followed: the will to rebuild, to remember, and to honor. The Battle of Caen began as a military objective. It ended as a symbol of human resilience. Its legacy is carved into stone, written in history, and carried in the quiet pride of a city that once lay in ashes and rose again to the sound of peace.